Everyone loves a good comeback story, and this is one of the most historically significant yet criminally undiscussed tales from the last 100 years. After World War II, the United States stood as one of the most powerful militaries in the world, cemented as possibly the most powerful following the decline of the British and French empires, along with the dramatic rise in defense spending in the US as the Cold War expanded. Going into the Vietnam War in the early 1960s, confidence in the military was immense, but within a few short years, it was obvious the war couldn't be won, and eventually resulted in an embarrassing withdrawal in 1973. The US military during this time was low on morale, manpower, and reputation, but today, the US Armed Forces are once again regarded as on the forefront of military power and capability. So how did they regain their place as one of the most dominant forces on the planet? Today we will explore how and why the United States lost the Vietnam War, the changes they made to their armed forces in the aftermath of their withdrawal, and how their renewed military might won the first Gulf War and catapulted the US back to their previous military prowess. The Vietnam War, a conflict taking place between 1955 and 1975, which saw the Soviet-backed Communist North Vietnamese combat the American-backed South Vietnamese to unify the fractured country in the wake of French colonial expulsion, and it just so happens to be my favourite war to study. Whilst the United States initially was only offering advisory military support, the nation was pulled fully into the conflict, with over 9 million American military personnel serving on active duty between 1961 and 1975. But despite this heavy commitment by them, the war was ultimately lost, with the United States pulling out of Vietnam in March of 1973, all Americans being out of the country by the end of April 1975, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon falling shortly after to the Communists. Many mistakes were made during the course of the war in both military policy and the decisions made on the battlefield, and these, coupled with the Viet Cong tactics and opposition to the war at home, the United States ultimately would be forced to withdraw from the conflict. To understand why the United States lost the Vietnam War, it is critical to understand what winning would have entailed. The main American objective in Vietnam was principally to stop and contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. This meaning that the United States would assist however possible to defeat the communist forces of North Vietnam, and support the South in unifying the country under an anti-communist government. At the time, the United States was concerned about what was called the domino theory, that being that if one nation were to fall to communism, so too would the nations around it, and viewed the rising communist sentiments in Vietnam as a direct threat to the Western world if they became allied with the Soviet Union. This is where problems arose for the United States, as the South Vietnamese government was incredibly ineffective and unpopular with the people, and thus a communist takeover was becoming more and more of a threat. In its 20-year existence, the South Vietnamese government was the subject of several military coups and assassinations, while also fending off full-fledged revolution by communist sympathizers and suppressing religious groups at the same time. In a now declassified 1964 report by the United States Air Force Project RAND, the South Vietnamese government is described as having serious military and political weaknesses, despite large-scale American commitments to the country, citing the lack of effective government control of a large number of provinces, military ineptitude, and deep internal divisions. The report goes on to state that the North will continue to undermine the Southern government's ability and will to resist, along with harassing the US into withdrawing from the country. These problems for the South's government are a critical reason why the United States could not win this war. The United States cannot remain in Vietnam forever, and if the South Vietnamese government can't stand without direct American assistance, then the government will inevitably fall to the Communists. This fact was known to the United States as early as 1963, then President Kennedy, just a few months before his untimely death, saying, "In the final analysis, it is their war. They are the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it. The people of Vietnam against the communists." Essentially, all the North Vietnamese had to do was wait for the US to become weary of war, and then could unify the country under their banner. Furthermore, another reason the United States could not win the Vietnam War was the organization and operation of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. Vietnam is an incredibly difficult place to wage a conventional war. It's a narrow strip of land covered in mountains and dense forests, which made it ideal for the Viet Cong to wage guerrilla warfare instead. The main tactics employed by the Viet Cong were 1. Encircle point, strike reinforcements, which is to encircle a point in order to induce reinforcement and to wipe out the reinforcements on the way. 2. Block reinforcements, strike point, which is to concentrate a superior number of troops to engulf a smaller number of enemies, using a small force to hold the area to be passed through by the advancing American and South Vietnamese troops, and thus blocking the advance of reinforcements by delaying action so as to gain time to strike the target area. 3. Surprise attack from a distance. A sudden strike is made by a rapid concealed approach from one or more distant points. And 4. Mobile attack, involving an unexpected attack and precipitous pullout, as well as a flexibility in shifting the main point of attack. All of these tactics are intended to result in short, decisive engagements, to chip away at the Southern and American forces before a counterattack can be mounted, and due to the Viet Cong maintaining the initiative, utilizing mobility, and using accurate intelligence gathered by scouts, these guerrilla tactics were very successful. Their better knowledge of the jungle terrain also contributed heavily to their successes. The United States' response to these tactics were their search and destroy operations, along with attempting to wage a war of attrition, and the sustained aerial bombardment of North Vietnam and the Ho Chi Minh Trail in neighboring Cambodia and Laos. Search and destroy operations were intended to locate and neutralize Viet Cong forces in the countryside, various platoons and companies being sent out into the field from their fortified positions. However, these tactics were largely ineffective, soldiers being easy targets during these search and destroy operations, along with it becoming increasingly difficult to determine who was friendly and who was the enemy, due to poor intelligence reports. Also, the brutality some American forces inflicted upon the Vietnamese people during these operations pushed many to support the North, further damaging the strength of the Southern forces. The extensive use of draftees to fight the war would also become a point of contention, many being underprepared for the war they were to fight and not wanting to be there in the first place, creating tensions between soldiers and their leaders, impairing the military's ability to fight effectively. The bombings were just as ineffective as search and destroy operations and using draftees. Bombing campaigns such as Operation Rolling Thunder carried out sustained aerial bombings of North Vietnamese positions, with the US dropping over 7.5 million tons of bombs over the course of the war, and this became the largest aerial bombardment in history. These bombings were meant to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but were unproductive due to the quick repairs made by the Vietnamese. Furthermore, most of these bombings were inaccurate or absorbed by the thick jungle terrain, and the US didn't have the capacity to bomb the North sufficiently to force them to surrender, unless they wanted to risk nuclear conflict, which they almost did. The offensive capabilities of the US were also severely limited, the commander of American forces, General William Westmoreland, not being authorized to launch ground attacks against North Vietnam or the enemy bases in Laos and Cambodia. Despite all this, the US won most of the major conventional battles of the war, but the lack of tangible progress in their aftermath would continue to erode the Americans' will to fight. Thus, the United States' attempts at using more conventional tactics in Vietnam, along with hindrances due to military policy, limited their effectiveness against an army fighting in a very unorthodox way, leading to a lack of significant battlefield successes and contributing heavily to the loss of the war. While woes within the South Vietnamese government and the failures of conventional tactics on the battlefield both played large roles in the United States' loss in Vietnam, the opposition movement within America also contributed to it heavily. Originating on college campuses, the anti-war movement developed rapidly, with hundreds of thousands of people protesting the war by 1969, and incidents such as the Kent State Massacre turned popular opinion against the war and the government in general. Public figures such as then heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali openly opposed the war, and refused to be drafted into the US Army, his conviction in federal court further fueling dissent and anti-war sentiments. Many popular bands at the time began creating anti-war anthems that became widespread across the country. Creedence Clearwater Revival with hits such as Fortunate Son and Run Through the Jungle, Eve of Destruction by Barry Maguire, and Gimme Shelter by the Rolling Stones, to name a few. These songs served to popularize anti-war ideas and would culminate in the iconic, and now infamous, Peace and Love Woodstock Festival in 1969. Along with this, the anti-war movement became tied into the civil rights causes and other activist movements of the 1960s and 70s, eventually spreading to the army itself, with soldiers refusing direct orders, printing underground anti-war newspapers, and organizing small-scale mutinies, crippling the ability of the army to function. The aforementioned use of draftees that mostly didn't want to be there, furthering anti-war sentiment amongst American troops in Vietnam. As public opinion towards the war soured, more leaks from the front lines and the government began to make their way to the press. The My Lai massacre, revealed to the public in 1969, and the Pentagon Papers in 1971, highlighted the grim realities of the Vietnam War, and how even some in the government were beginning to lose faith in the endeavor. The media can shoulder quite a lot of blame for the loss of the war, the majority of news outlets covering the conflict painting it in a negative light, dampening public support, and by the end of 1972, 60% of the war-weary US felt that sending combat troops to Vietnam was a mistake. As well as this, the media's uncensored coverage of Vietnam provided valuable information about American forces and the areas in which they were operating to the enemy, giving an intelligence advantage to the North. The lack of confidence in the war and the government's handling of it, combined with the increasing popularity of the anti-war movement, forced a suspension of the draft in January 1973, and an end to US combat operations in Vietnam, severely damaging the United States' capacity to support the South. Therefore, the crippling of the US Army politically by the media and the anti-war movement contributed heavily to its eventual withdrawal from Vietnam. The loss of the Vietnam War is an incredibly complex topic with many moving parts. There is no single factor that caused the United States to withdraw from the conflict. It was a gradual process that took place over several years. Incompatible tactics, poor public support, and an ineffective South Vietnamese government all played a role in the loss of Vietnam. Vietnam became a key inflection point for the US military, with many changes being made to the whole body as a result of the lessons learned from the conflict. Between the withdrawal from Vietnam and Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, many changes were made to the US military to rectify the policy mistakes of Vietnam, improve their equipment, and return to their place as the world's most powerful military. In 1973, and into the following few years, the US military was in a terrible place. Not only were they forced to withdraw from Vietnam, but public trust towards the institution was at an all-time low. Soldiers returning from combat were faced with a hostile reception, and many had become drug addicts due to the plentiful supply of heroin available in Vietnam. The military that left Vietnam was at a low point in terms of morale, discipline, and battlefield effectiveness, and these, compounded with racial tensions between soldiers and the poor leadership of officers, created an image of the US military that, 30 years earlier, at the end of World War II, would have seemed unfathomable. Somehow, however, by January of 1991, the US military was more capable than ever. When the United States began its campaign in the Middle East, beginning with Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm in the Gulf War, it bore no resemblance to the beaten and battered force that had left Vietnam. What had changed? How had the nation's armed forces managed to restore its former glory in such a short amount of time? Advances in technology, weaponry, vehicles, and military policy all contributed to the drastic improvement in the US military by the start of the Gulf War. One of the most criticized and dreaded aspects of the Vietnam War was the extensive use of draftees. Initially, those that were drafted felt a duty to serve in Vietnam. Their fathers and grandfathers had served their country in Korea and World War II. so why should they be any different? However, as the war progressed, the situation became increasingly dire, and the prospects of the United States and South Vietnam coming out on top dwindled. The draftees became increasingly anti-war, with soldiers beginning to question why they were there in the first place. They had no real stake in the conflict. The Vietnamese hadn't attacked America or its allies, and many felt that the issue of Vietnamese reunification should be left, appropriately, to the Vietnamese. In 1969, the newly elected President Nixon formed the Gates Commission to develop a plan to replace the draft, and by 1972, animosity towards the selective service draft would lead to it being, in the words of President Nixon, on standby, with the last draft call in December of 1972. It would be confirmed to be fully ended by Defense Secretary Melvin Laird following the signing of the Paris Peace Accords on January 27, 1973. Officially ending American involvement in Vietnam. This was a key lesson learned from Vietnam, that using draftees that aren't willing to fight and risk their lives for a cause they don't fully believe in is not going to win a war. After 1973, the US military switched to an all-volunteer force, something the Department of Defense had been planning on doing since November of 1968. But there were concerns surrounding the feasibility of getting enough quality recruits to enlist, and if the country would be able to foot the bill. The monetary issues around an all-volunteer force stem from the fact that, with the draft, the army didn't have to offer monetary incentives to get people to join. They were selected by a lottery system, and then that was that. Money would also be needed to advertise the army, and also to eliminate negative aspects of military life. Lobbying for funding fixed the monetary issues, with civilians filling the less desirable duties formerly left to draftees. And coupled with new advertisements and the lowering of the number of servicemen from over 1.5 million to 785,000, the military began receiving high-quality recruits incredibly quickly, meeting recruitment quotas by November 1973, and exceeding them in the following months. The expansion of women's roles in the military opened up an untapped avenue for higher quality recruits, and, despite some initial pushback and harassment, by the beginning of the Gulf War, 8.6% of those deployed were women. In addition, training for recruits was updated to meet the needs of current conflicts, new schools being developed to facilitate new weapons and systems on the battlefield, in order to ensure soldiers were prepared for the realities of the modern battlefield, with an emphasis on rigor and raising standards for all soldiers. All these efforts to facilitate the all-volunteer force gave the US military the quality manpower it so desperately needed, and in a much faster fashion than anyone could have anticipated. Now they had the renewed manpower, the military needed a renewed doctrine, and this would arrive in the form of air-land battle. During Vietnam, the Americans were woefully unprepared for the type of war they were to fight, and this was a major vulnerability to them at the time, as their conventional tactics found limited success. The tactics of the Viet Cong worked dramatically better in the mountains and dense forests of Vietnam, and the United States had not really tried to adapt, so they began studying the ongoing conflicts such as the Arab-Israeli War, noting the use of missiles and the importance of combined arms units, and began developing a new military doctrine. Initially, the idea of active defense was the new doctrine beginning in 1976, but this would be improved upon by 1982, emerging as air-land battle. This new doctrine would require commanders to simultaneously supervise three types of operations: close, far, and rear. Close operations are the conventional battles, various large divisions fighting through close combat, maneuvering, and indirect fire support. Deep operations involve less direct means of waging war, utilizing deception and surveillance to disrupt enemy forces and provide intelligence to nearby combat units. Finally, rear operations proceed alongside close and deep operations, moving reserves and supplies through friendly areas, continuing logistical efforts to sustain battles, and providing continuity with command. The new doctrine took a page from the playbook of the Viet Cong, emphasizing the seizure of initiative and acting faster than the enemy could react, along with synchronizing the combat power of ground and air forces during battle. It also stressed the usage of air power and armored divisions to assist ground forces, combining the combat power of every facet of the military to fight more effectively. Furthermore, air-land battle highlighted the need for new military technology, as they knew their Cold War adversaries in the Warsaw Pact outnumbered them in sheer manpower and materials, and set about developing new technology in order to fight outnumbered and win. Budgetary restrictions prevented the US military from being able to match the Soviets and their allies in these regards, but concluded that they could use their superior technology to win battles. So, the army began work on what they called the Big Five equipment systems: a new tank, infantry combat vehicle, attack helicopter, transport helicopter, and anti-aircraft missile. Many of these weapon systems were already in development before the introduction of air-land battle, but the new doctrine would have a heavy influence on the direction development would take. The first of these new systems was a new tank. The tanks in service with the US during Vietnam were the M48 and M60, but by this time they were being surpassed, slowly but surely, by advances in Soviet technology. So, to maintain armored superiority, a new tank would be required. After funding was pulled from a number of prototype projects, the Army would build the XM1 prototype in 1976, which proved incredibly successful and became what we now know as the M1 Abrams. This tank offered better speed and protection to previous American tanks, using Chobham-spaced armor, while a sophisticated fire control system provided main gun stabilization for shooting on the move, also utilizing a precise laser range finder, thermal imaging night sights, and a digital ballistic computer to maximize the utility of the 105mm main gun. In 1985, the M1A1 Abrams was produced, having improved armor and a larger 120mm gun to improve protection and lethality. Next up was the infantry combat vehicle, and that would arrive in the form of the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle. The M113 personnel carrier being used previously was rendered virtually obsolete by advances in armor-penetrating weapons and its slow speed. So in 1980, the M2 was developed, offering not only superior armor, but also a host of weapons: a 25mm cannon, 7.62mm machine gun, and a tow missile launcher, in order to keep soldiers protected and defend themselves should the need arise, along with enabling it to be used as a scouting vehicle. The third system, an attack helicopter, would arrive in 1982. Previously, the AH-1 Cobra attack helicopter in service was extremely vulnerable to even light anti-aircraft fire, and lacked the agility to fly close to the ground for extended periods, problems that the new AH-64A Apache would rectify. Along with this, the new attack helicopter was more fiercely armed, carrying 16 heat-seeking Hellfire missiles or 76 70mm rockets, or a combination of both, whilst also having a Hughes 30mm chain gun mounted on its nose, rather than the twin miniguns and 8 missiles on the Cobra. The next system would be replacing the Vietnam Icon, the UH-1 Iroquois transport helicopter, and this was already in production, the 1974 UH-60A Black Hawk. This transport helicopter offered greater carrying capacity along with being faster and quieter than the Huey, being able to reliably lift a whole infantry squad or a 105mm howitzer with its crew and some ammunition. Finally, the fifth system, the anti-aircraft missile, and this would come in the form of the Patriot missile system, replacing the Hawk missile system in the early 80s. Despite some controversy over costs and development times, the Patriot missile required virtually no maintenance and had the speed and agility to match known threats, and a battalion armed with Patriot missiles had the firepower of several Hawk battalions, thus making the time and money investment certainly worth it. These 5 systems were not the only improvements post-Vietnam, the M16A1 rifle that was notoriously unreliable in combat being updated with the M16A2 in 1983, along with new transport vehicles to replace the World War II-era Jeeps, as well as a family of new command, control, communications, and intelligence hardware. All of the advancements made during this time period ensured that even if the US found themselves outnumbered in mere numbers of men, they could still be victorious due to the power their new technology carried, and by 1990, all of these systems were operational and ready for combat. The final piece of the puzzle was to improve the overall command structure of the US military. Since 1955, the US Continental Army Command, or CONARC, had been in charge of the various US armies across the globe, and in 1962 created the Army Materiel Command, or AMC, and the Combat Developments Command, or CDC, to manage force development and control the technical services. As the Army began to withdraw from Vietnam, General William Westmoreland directed an extensive review of the Army's organizational structure to determine its effectiveness and the necessity of changes to the institution. By 1970, this review, named the Parker Panel, issued 68 recommendations for overhauls to the Army's structure, and by 1972, Lieutenant General William Dupuy began breaking up Army commands and reassigning their functions despite protests from CONARC and CDC leaders. Named the Steadfast Reorganization, it replaced the large CONARC body with smaller functional commands, those being FORSCOM, TRADOC, and AMC. FORSCOM is the new Army Forces Command, and assumed command of all active and reserve Army forces, consolidating the existing 6 armies into 3 Continental United States Armies, or CON-USAs, with a heavy focus on combat readiness. TRADOC is the Army Training and Doctrine Command, which combines all military schools along with the combat development functions inherited from the Army's previous Combat Developments Command. Finally, AMC is the previously mentioned Army Materiel Command, which specializes in Materiel Development and Logistics Command, also providing maintenance work and parts to the various sectors of the military. This reorganization of the Army Command increased the effectiveness of the military and streamlined its structure, as each new command had specific responsibilities and agendas unique to them, leaving no room for overlaps or confusion about their tasks. Vietnam had given the US military a taste of defeat, and with the changes they made after withdrawing, they aimed to never have to experience that again. A new high-quality and willing armed force, improved weapons technology, a new military doctrine, and a reorganized army rebuilt the US military back into a true fighting force, but one problem remained. This military was still untested. There had been small conflicts during the Steadfast Reorganization, such as the US invasions of Grenada and Panama, but nothing near the scale and significance of Vietnam, and even so, the invasion of Grenada is considered a slight embarrassment for the United States. The changes made to the military took many years to implement, and now that they were operational, the United States felt prepared to combat any foe around the globe. And in August of 1990, the stage was set for a showdown between the renewed American military and the formidable Iraqi army that had just invaded Kuwait, and would let them know, in no uncertain terms, if their changes had restored their military prowess. August 2nd, 1990, news broke that the elite Iraqi Republican Guard had invaded neighboring Kuwait, an army that, when fully mobilized, numbered over 1 million men, and was well equipped with massive amounts of Soviet armaments. For the American government, the defense of nearby Saudi Arabia was of utmost importance. The disruption of Kuwaiti oil had damaged the global economy enough, and if the same happened to the Saudis, the consequences could be much worse. Thus, the US military began to mobilize for the defense of the Saudi borders with Kuwait and Iraq. But one question was on everyone's minds: could the US complete its mission this time? As it would turn out, not only did they complete it, but their victory in the Gulf War would catapult the US military back to its former global supremacy, not seen since World War II. But when American troops arrived in Saudi Arabia on August 6th, they were still largely untested, the few conflicts they had been involved in since Vietnam, such as Grenada and Panama, not being the most favorable, and the whole world was ready to watch their trial by fire. Operation Desert Shield was the code name for the American military buildup in and defense of Saudi Arabia, and unlike they had in Vietnam, the US did not underestimate their enemy. From the beginning, the Iraqi army was treated incredibly seriously, and in a little over 2 months, the US sent the powerful 18th Airborne Corps to the Persian Gulf, including over 120,000 troops, 700 tanks, 1,400 armored fighting vehicles, and 600 artillery pieces in conjunction with the 32,000 troops and 400 tanks provided by American allies in the Middle East. Furthermore, hundreds of aircraft were operating out of Saudi airfields, along with the airfields of American allies in the region, such as Turkey and Qatar, as well as more aircraft operating from aircraft carriers. Speaking of naval vessels, the US Navy was put on active duty and began imposing an effective blockade on Iraq's coast in the Persian Gulf. It was clear to all that the United States had no intention of repeating the mistakes of Vietnam. By the time Operation Desert Shield was at full strength, had the Iraqis chosen to attack Saudi territory, they would have been met with waves of sustained airstrikes, been driven into heavy and precisely surveyed artillery fire, and encountered the accuracy and firepower of the M1A1 Abrams tank, all before they had the opportunity to engage in effective combat. This barrage of armaments on the Iraqi army would have continued for the entire 200-kilometer stretch they would have to attack through to reach any target in Saudi Arabia that had strategic significance. However, the Iraqis stayed away from the Saudi borders, and their leader, Saddam Hussein, was increasingly frustrating the international community in finding a diplomatic solution to what at the time was just a small Middle Eastern flashpoint, and in November 1990, the mission was changed, now to the liberation of Kuwait. Operation Desert Shield was about to become Operation Desert Storm. By this time, the Iraqi army had firmly entrenched themselves along the Saudi-Kuwait border, reinforced by tank and other mechanized divisions, and breaking through these defenses would be the most direct route for retaking Kuwait. But initially, the United States and her allies of Great Britain and France wanted to attack Iraq directly. Concerns about a large ground war from their Arab allies, however, would lead to a new offensive strategy to be launched at the Iraqis. The fighting would begin with a multi-phased air campaign smashing through Iraqi air defenses, securing aerial supremacy, suppressing Iraqi command and control, and isolating the Kuwaiti theatre of operations in order to establish favourable conditions for a ground assault, whilst weakening Iraqi defences safely. Once this was done, the ground assault would begin with a number of division-sized feints around Kuwait and into Iraq, to draw attention away from the main attack of the 7th Infantry Corps, consisting of 5 heavy divisions, 4 separate field artillery brigades, an armoured cavalry regiment, and a separate aviation brigade. In January of 1991, this campaign against the Iraqi-occupied Kuwait was ready, and codenamed Operation Desert Storm. Then, on January 17th, the campaign began, and it was finally time to see if this plan would work, and if the United States could redeem itself from its military failures during and since the Vietnam War. The operation commenced in the early hours of the 17th, first with the aerial campaign against Iraq. Massive airstrikes and missile bombardments into Iraqi territory secured air supremacy for the United States, and did enough damage to cripple Iraqi command and control, along with disrupting their logistics. Anti-aircraft and radar sites in Iraq and Kuwait were the key targets, and American aircraft successfully eliminated the threats to their air supremacy. However, against the entrenched equipment of the Iraqis, it was less effective, but this would change when the ground assault would begin, forcing the movement of this protected equipment. Another issue with the air campaign was the surprise use of missiles by the Iraqis, known as Scuds. These were relatively primitive missiles, and the Iraqis only fired 86, but they were still hitting targets in Saudi Arabia, and there was the potential of Iraq firing them at Israel, a move that threatened the careful alliances the US had made with several Arab nations. Thus, their use pushed some of the forces dedicated to laying the groundwork for the ground assault to be diverted to hunt down Iraqi missiles. But overall, the air campaign from January 17th to February 24th was a great success. Now it was time for the ground assault, commencing on February 24th, and with American aerial power proven, the ground forces of the United States were ready to prove themselves as well. The Desert Storm ground assault began with a number of feints and supporting attacks to distract and confuse the Iraqi forces. First was the 5th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, creating the impression amongst Iraqi forces that an amphibious assault was imminent, and news coverage of the brigade supposedly preparing for such an assault shook the Iraqis enough for them to set up 4 divisions along its coastal areas, diverting forces for an attack that would never come. Next, the 1st Cavalry Division began by feinting up the Wadi al-Batin River, drawing the attention of 5 Iraqi divisions, and after doing some significant damage to them, the 1st Cavalry Division backed out and moved west to assist the main ground assault. These 2 deceptions worked brilliantly, the Iraqis fully believing an amphibious assault on the coast and a push up the Wadi al-Batin were coming, and by the time the real invasion was happening, 20% of the Iraqi forces were out of the fight. The Iraqis would try to redeploy their forces once they realized their mistake, but by then it was too late. Simultaneously, 3 supporting attacks had begun, the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force pushing from the elbow of Kuwait into Kuwait City, alongside the other 2 supporting attacks of the Saudi and Gulf Coalition comprised Joint Forces Command East, and Egyptian, Syrian, and Saudi-comprised Joint Forces Command North. By February 27th, these 3 supporting attacks had made it to Kuwait City, liberating the city, capturing thousands of Iraqi soldiers, and destroying dozens of their armored vehicles. Alongside this, the 18th Airborne Corps initiated its own mission to isolate the Kuwaiti theatre, to cut the Iraqis in Kuwait off from their supply lines in Iraq, preventing new units from reaching Kuwait, and combat units from retreating back into Iraq. A combined assault of ground troops and attack helicopters began attacking the Iraqi routes into Kuwait, intercepting ground movement of Iraqi forces and accomplishing their mission with minimal force. The United States forces and their coalition allies had been incredibly successful with these feints and supporting attacks, putting the Iraqi forces in disarray and crippling them severely. And while all of this is occurring, the main assault is also underway. The main assault would be carried out primarily by the combined British and American 7th Corps, consisting of nearly 150,000 troops and almost 50,000 vehicles, a force so massive it spanned a width of 24 kilometers. This assault would demonstrate the full firepower and tactical bravado of the renewed US military against the formidable Iraqi Republican Guard. Tightly synchronized teams of M1A1 Abrams tanks and M2 Bradley APCs penetrated through Iraqi minefields and other obstacles they'd erected, with the rest of the ground forces pushing through the cracks opened up by the armored divisions. The Abrams tanks and Bradleys continued to advance on the front line, destroying Iraqi armor, with infantry units disembarking along the way as needed to clear positions and collect prisoners. Howitzers from the rear continued to bombard Iraqi positions effectively, but the advance of the coalition forces was so fast that they rarely had a chance to fire. Furthermore, the American equipment of night vision sights allowed for the aggression to continue regardless of the hour, and all of the coalition forces combined surprised, outflanked, outranged, and in any given exchange outgunned the Iraqis. This decisive attack achieved decisive results, and within 100 hours of the ground assault's launch, Operation Desert Storm had successfully liberated Kuwait from Iraqi forces, with only 148 American soldiers losing their lives. Finally, after almost 2 decades, the United States military had redeemed itself. None of what happened in the Gulf War would have been possible without the significant changes made to the US military post-Vietnam. The introduction of new military technology, new training, better command structures, and the all-volunteer force all played a role in the success of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. The embarrassed force that left Vietnam was now once again arguably the most powerful military in the world, and had demonstrated to everyone that the United States is a force to be reckoned with. Instead of refusing to acknowledge their mistakes and repeating them, they grew from the lessons learnt from Vietnam. The mission was clear, the force carrying it out was ready and willing, the weapons they used were superior and effective, and the command structure was more streamlined. And now, they were victorious. The United States had pulled off the greatest modern military comeback, and over the course of the next 20 years would continue its successes, having many more successful operations and facing little in the way of defeats. But for now, the war was won, and all of America could be proud of the job done by their armed forces. Thank you so very much for watching these videos. Please like and subscribe and comment below what you'd like to see me cover next.